Good evening everyone, and welcome here to this Wednesday evening session. And my understanding is it's a 2.5-hour session and we have a sort of a half-hour break in the middle, so therefore we'll do like 2 1-hour sessions and we'll do a meditation in each of those sessions. In fact, we'll begin with a short meditation now. I think Martin's telling me that you've been looking at the 4 immeasurables, a very important part, not only of within Tibetan Mahayana Buddhism, but in all Buddhist schools. These 4 immeasurables really form the basis of what's called the compassion wing of practice. The 2 main aspects of practice, of course, are wisdom and compassion, often called the 2 wings of practice. And the foundation of the compassion wing, I think in all Buddhist schools, are these 4 immeasurables. Of course, in Tibetan Buddhism, which is part of Mahayana, we sort of build on top of that, but that is the basis. So I'm very happy to talk about that this evening. So we'll go over some various points about that. But first, let's start with a short meditation just to sort of relax the body, relax the mind, and setting a good motivation. So we can begin by setting up a good posture. So keeping the back nice and straight. And at the same time, allow the entire body to become completely relaxed, completely at ease. So we can bring our attention into the body and simply become aware of sensations throughout the body. And if you notice any area of tightness or tension in any part of the body, then use the out-breath to relax and release that tightness or tension as best you can. And then bringing your awareness to the area of your face. And soften and relax all the muscles in the face. Mouth and jaw soft and relaxed. And all the muscles around the eyes soft and relaxed. In this way, allowing the entire body to become completely relaxed, completely at ease. And allowing the breathing to settle into its natural rhythm. Not trying to control or regulate the breath in any way. Simply allow it to flow naturally and effortlessly. And then give yourself permission to let go of any hopes or fears, worries or concerns about the past or the future. To give yourself permission to let go of all of these things for the duration of this short meditation. You can attend to those things later if you wish. And simply allow your mind to come to rest in the present moment. And simply focus on the sensations of the breath throughout the body. Wherever you can most easily notice any sensations associated with the breathing. And maintain an ongoing flow of mindfulness of the sensations of the breath throughout the entire cycle of each in and out breath. And if you notice that you've become distracted from the breath, then the very first thing to do is simply relax. No need to get upset or frustrated. Simply relax. Be happy that you've noticed that you've become distracted. And then let go of the distraction, release the distraction, and then very gently return to focusing on the breath. So relax, release, and return. Each time you notice you've become distracted. Simply keep coming back to the breath again and again, patiently and persistently, happily. And then think about your motivation for coming here this evening. Bring that to mind. And then try to set the best possible motivation for attending this session here this evening. And if possible, expand your motivation out to include others. That we're not just doing this for our own benefit, but we're doing it so that we can be of more benefit to those around us. And then keeping this motivation in mind, we can slowly finish this meditation and we can begin our discussions together here this evening. So I thought we could begin with a little bit of an overview of these 4 immeasurables. And with the session this evening, I always like to be very interactive. So if at any time you have any questions, then please ask the question. So it's not like I'm just providing a lot of information for you and then some maybe at the end you can ask some questions. I like to be much more interactive. So anytime you have any doubt or any question, then please ask questions. So let's have a look at these 4 immeasurables, these 4 qualities that are really the foundation of the compassion wing of practice I think in all Buddhist schools. And they're called the 4 immeasurables. The word immeasurable here is referring to immeasurable living beings or immeasurable sentient beings, meaning that these are 4 qualities that we are cultivating towards all living beings. And the first one of those, of course, is loving kindness. The original Sanskrit word was Maitri and the Pali word is Metta. So of course the original teachings of the Buddha were transmitted from India through these 2 main ancient languages of Pali and Sanskrit. And it was through the Pali language that Buddhism spread to Sri Lanka and then up through the northeast into Burma, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, and down into Southeast Asia. So in all of those Buddhist traditions now, when they go back to the original Buddhist texts, they will be from the Pali language. Whereas Buddhism also spread through the Sanskrit language, and that spread up through the northwest of India, up through now what's sort of Afghanistan, Pakistan. It went over the Himalayas onto the Silk Route, and then went across the Silk Route into China, Korea, Japan, and down to Vietnam, and then also over the Himalayas into Tibet. So in all of those Buddhist traditions now, when they go back to the original Buddhist texts, they will be written in the Sanskrit language. So there are some similarities between Sanskrit and Pali, of course. So I always tend to when there's important terms or concepts that are presented, generally I will go back to the Sanskrit language because, of course, the centre is part of Tibetan Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism is based on the Sanskrit texts. And the reason I do that is that often a lot of confusion in Buddhism is simply through terminology. That the original Sanskrit and Pali terms often have very precise meanings, and when they're translated into English or even through Tibetan into English, sometimes a lot of meaning is lost because the term, the original term, and even coming from Tibetan Buddhism, the Tibetan Buddhist written language was actually developed for Buddhism. When Buddhism came into Tibet, there was no written language in Tibet. So they developed it for Buddhist translation, which meant the terms they developed are very precise. So what you'll find in Tibetan Buddhism, that the terms used often are very precise translation of the Sanskrit. But of course then when things are translated either from Tibetan or Sanskrit or even Pali into English, difficult. Because often some of these terms, there is no word in the English language which has the same meaning. So then the translator's forced to pick a word that sort of maybe is similar. And unfortunately, often the word in English, the way we use it, often has a lot of other different meanings. And so when we see that word, that's what we think. whereas the original Sanskrit term doesn't mean that at all. And so I find that a lot of confusion is simply because of terminology. So therefore, again, I always like to go back to the original Sanskrit word, describe the definition or etymology of that word, and say, well, this is the word we normally use in English. And so when you see that word in English, in a Buddhist context, it means this and not maybe what we normally think. And so actually this is an example where often there can be confusion. This Maitri and Metta is defined, which is translated here as loving kindness, is simply the wish for ourselves and others to be happy. Or another way of saying that, the wish for ourselves and others to have happiness and its causes. And so sometimes Maitri and Metta is translated as love, but that creates confusion. Because in our English language, the word love is an emotion, and it often implies some sort of intimate behavior. Whereas Maitri and Metta is not an emotion. And it certainly doesn't imply any sort of intimate behavior. Maitri and Metta is an aspiration, it's a wish. So therefore it's much better to translate Maitri and Metta as loving kindness, because loving kindness is an attitude, it's an aspiration, rather than an emotion. So therefore, again, it's much better to, I think, use the word loving kindness rather than the word love here. So again, just to briefly define loving kindness, it's the wish for ourselves and others to be happy, or again, in other words, the wish for ourselves and others to have happiness and its causes. And related to that, in Buddhism, you will often hear about cultivating positive emotions and eliminating negative or disturbing emotions. But again, I think this is a bit misleading, because a lot of these things which are often talked about as positive emotions and negative or disturbing emotions are in fact not emotions at all. They're not emotions at all, as is in the case here. So I find that it's important to be as precise as possible, otherwise a lot of confusion comes in. So again here, loving kindness, the wish for ourselves and others to have happiness and its causes, or to be happy. And so then immeasurable loving kindness is the wish, of course, for all living beings to have happiness and its causes. And this quality, as similar to the second one, which we're going to look at briefly soon, compassion, it's recommended we cultivate these in stages. That we first, in the text usually it says, first cultivate loving kindness toward friends, because most easy to wish your friends to be happy. Quite easy. And once you're comfortable with that, then you can expand that out to people you don't know very well. And once you're comfortable cultivating that with those, then you expand out to people, the so-called difficult people, the ones that you maybe don't really like. And then from there, expand it out to all living beings. So usually these are the 4 stages that are recommended in cultivating this immeasurable loving kindness. But I think in our modern society, we need to add one more step in the process that's usually not mentioned at all in the original texts, because I don't think it was necessary. And that is, at the beginning, to cultivate loving kindness toward ourselves. Because unfortunately in our modern society, we tend not to have a very good attitude toward ourselves. You know, we have often a lot of low self-esteem and maybe even some self-hatred toward ourselves in the modern society. So if we want to cultivate this towards others, we have to have that toward ourselves first. And I think in the earlier days, in the earlier centuries, it wasn't mentioned, because I think generally in those days people felt okay about themselves. In fact, when Buddhism now I'm talking Tibetan Buddhism, but I think it applies to other forms of Buddhism, when that first came into the so-called Western countries 50 or 60 years ago or so, and then Westerners came to the Lama or the teacher with all their issues and problems. One of the main things is, oh, I've got low self-esteem and I feel guilty about all sorts of things. What can I do about that? And usually it was through a translator that they would ask this question. And the translator had all sorts of problems even to make the question understandable to the teacher, to the Tibetan Lama. Because in fact, in Tibetan, there is no word for guilt. It doesn't exist in the Tibetan language at all. And even low self-esteem is like a foreign concept. To not feel good about yourself is like, what? In fact, this happened at one of the early conferences. His Holiness Dalai Lama is part of this Mind and Life organization that is trying to bring Buddhism and science and psychology together, and they meet together regularly. And in one of the early conferences, I think it was mainly psychologists were there, and one of the psychologists, I think, was talking about low self-esteem, and then His Holiness said, oh, no, I don't think that's possible. And then the psychologists, and these were all mainly psychologists, he said to them, how many of you suffer from low self-esteem? And many people put their hand up, and His Holiness apparently was quite shocked that, that this was so prevalent. Of course, now he's well aware of these things, but this was many years ago. So therefore, I think here, if we're not really feeling good about ourselves, then that's where we need to start, And there's something I want to talk about related to that, but I want to talk about that with respect to the next quality, compassion. Now, I believe Martin tells me that when you talked about loving kindness, you talked about the near and the far enemy of those qualities. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the near enemies. Because far enemies, it's something obvious. So a far enemy is something that's directly opposite. It's something that's obviously the opposite of what you're trying to develop. So it's easy to see that's what you're trying to work against to develop this quality. But the near enemy, of course, is something that seems to be this quality, but actually it's opposite. It pollutes and corrupts this quality. And so, who can remember what the near enemy of loving kindness was? Everyone's forgotten already. So what is the thing that looks like loving kindness but actually creates problems? No. Attachment. So I'd like to briefly talk about that because I think this is also a very important point. Because here we're talking about cultivating loving kindness toward everybody, in fact all living beings. But also, of course, attachment from a Buddhist perspective is one of the main mental afflictions that we need to completely eliminate. And so often then when people hear that, attachment you need to get rid of 100%, people go, ooh, I'm not sure about that. One of the other, of course, core mental afflictions is anger. And so generally when people hear, oh, we need to get rid of anger, they go, yeah, of course we understand that's very harmful and destructive, let's get rid of that. But what about attachment? I don't think I want to get rid of my attachment because I'm not so sure it's something negative. And actually, I think in certain cases, I might actually need it. And so there's a lot of confusion and doubt about that. So I'd like to try and clarify that a little bit, and a little bit with respect to this loving kindness as well. And I think, again, part of the problem here is terminology. Because we use the word attachment in Buddhism, And that same word attachment is often used in psychology, of course. And if you look at what psychology says about attachment and what Buddhism says about attachment, they don't seem to sort of agree. And you think, well, the Buddhists are saying this, the psychologists are saying this, who's right? And here I think generally the difficulty is that both the Buddhists and the psychologists using the same word define in a different way. And that's a lot of the problem here. Because you find in psychology, we talk about attachment theory. And in psychology, they often talk about healthy forms of attachment which are necessary to develop. Of course, there are unhealthy forms of attachment we need to get rid of, but there are, in fact, healthy forms of attachment we need to actively cultivate. And often the example they give, the classic example, is the strong bond between mother and child. And they call that attachment. From a Buddhist perspective, the strong bond between mother and child is not attachment. But we use the same word. So it's not like Buddhism saying, no, don't have a strong bond between mother and child. In fact, Buddhism is saying, have a strong bond between everyone, to everyone. And so the word attachment in Buddhism is defined simply as a mental factor that sees its object as attractive, it exaggerates the object's attractiveness, and then wishes to hold and possess the object. Why? Because attachment believes that object, which could be a person, is the source of my happiness. So I want it. That's attachment. So that is very unhealthy, because if we talk about a relationship, we talk about eliminating attachment, then often people feel that if I get rid of attachment, there's no basis for any sort of relationship. How can I have a relationship without attachment? And so then the thing to realize here is that in any relationship, there are two dynamics. There is the healthy dynamic of loving kindness, which in the relationship is simply the wish for that person to be happy. And then the unhealthy dynamic of attachment, which is all about me, me, me. And usually they're mixed together. So it seems like there's only one thing going on. So it seems like if we get rid of attachment, there goes the relationship. But we need to distinguish these two aspects individually, and we need to increase the loving kindness part and decrease the attachment part. And the way to distinguish that is, again, loving kindness in a relationship is saying, is basically the wish for that person to be happy. And the fine print, of course, is without expecting anything in return. Or we would call unconditional love, no strings attached love. Conditional love or loving kindness, or strings attached loving kindness, is loving kindness polluted by attachment. And that sounds like this: I will love you as long as, and here comes the condition, as long as you keep saying and doing things that make me happy. Otherwise, no. That's attachment speaking. So the way to distinguish loving kindness and attachment in a relationship, loving kindness is saying, I want you to be happy. Attachment is saying, I want you to make me happy. So attachment's all about me, 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 me. And in a relationship, attachment sees the other person as an object, as a thing to satisfy me. That's not very nice to be on the other end of that, to be seen as an object for someone else's gratification or pleasure. I mean, that's not very nice. So I think, therefore, we need, in any relationship, whether it's our partner, family, work colleagues, we need to distinguish these two aspects and increase the loving kindness as much as we can and decrease the attachment as much as we can. And of course, the reality is that attachment is pervasive in our life. In fact, in Buddhism, this world we live in is often called the desire realm. Why? Because the main driving factor in our entire life is desire, craving, attachment. That is what's driving our life. So we should not think that, okay, I'll get rid of my attachment in my relationship. I should be able to do that by next week. It's not going to happen. This will be a lifelong journey. And the more that we can reduce and eliminate attachment, the more healthy our relationships will be. So this is the near enemy of loving kindness. But maybe one or two more points about attachment, and that is, often then people feel like when they hear that Buddhism says, oh, you've got to get rid of attachment 100%, again, people have some resistance and go, oh, I don't think I want to do that, because if I get rid of attachment, my life's going to be very bland and boring. I'm not going to be able to enjoy anything anymore. Actually, it's the complete opposite. The complete opposite. Our attachment interferes with our enjoyment of the simple pleasures in life. And we know this from our own experience. Particularly if we have very strong craving and attachment for something, we don't enjoy it because we have a lot of worry and anxiety about not getting it, not getting enough of it, losing it. And all these things interfere with our enjoyment of that person or thing because we're so uptight. And then, of course, when it finishes, we get frustrated, we want more, and it's just a big mess doing that. So therefore, if we can reduce our attachment, we will actually enjoy the simple pleasures in life much more than we have ever done in our life. And just to highlight that, there's an example from my own experience to highlight this. As Martin said many years ago, I did this study program, this 7-year study program, and as part of that at the end we were to do a 9-month solitary retreat. So I ended up in this retreat centre in Spain on the side of a mountain, and the retreat centre cooked for you, and they left a little basket near your hut every day with food. And the food was very nutritious, but basically every week it was the same menu. So if there's a certain food we like, but we're eating it week after week after week, it doesn't take too many weeks before we go, oh God, not that again. No? True? Why? Because attachment is never satisfied. Never. An attachment's always looking for something bigger, better, and different. So not only does it interfere with our enjoyment because worried about not getting enough of it or losing it and so forth, on top of that, if we enjoy something too often, the same thing, attachment after some time goes, sorry, that's not good enough anymore. I want something bigger, better, and different. So we actually stop enjoying the things we used to because attachment's not happy with that anymore. Whereas in the retreat, my experience was very different. I was eating the same food, and then after a month of eating the same food every week, it started tasting better. And I was convinced that the cook was putting more effort into the cooking. I thought, wow, the cook's really paying much more attention. It's much more tasty than it was a month ago. And then after a couple more weeks, it kept tasting better. And then after a few more weeks, the penny dropped. And I thought, this is exactly the same food as 6 weeks ago. What was happening is, due to being in meditation retreat, my mind was calming down, my craving and attachment was subsiding, which meant I was actually starting to enjoy the food more because no agitation and craving and no expectation of something. So it started to taste better. well, actually it wasn't tasting better, it was just less craving and attachment. I was enjoying it. It was the same taste as 6 weeks ago, but I was actually enjoying it. I mean, much more than I've ever enjoyed food in my entire life. And the same thing was, I was in a hut on the side of a mountain, a big, beautiful, spacious view, Mediterranean in the distance. Again, if we're in a place that has a big, beautiful view, it doesn't take too many days of being there. We don't even notice the view anymore. Don't even notice it. My experience, again, opposite. The view kept getting more and more beautiful. And then even little things, the tiny little flowers, wow, so beautiful. Again, it was simply because my craving and attachment was settling down. I was enjoying the things I enjoyed much more, and I was starting to enjoy things that previously my craving and attachment goes, boring, 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 boring. I was really enjoying it. And so this is what we can expect. If we reduce attachment, we'll enjoy the simple pleasures way more than we've ever done in our entire life. That was my experience, and that's what Buddhism says. But then, one more thing, and then we'll move on to compassion, is people, when you explain this, they go, okay, maybe I can see that if I reduce my attachment, I may enjoy simple pleasures more, maybe. And maybe if I sort of reduce attachment, my relationships might improve. Okay, maybe that could be right, but I'm a creative person and I definitely need attachment to be creative. If I don't have attachment, I can't be creative. Again, completely opposite to that. No doubt, things like craving, attachment, jealousy, anger provide a lot of fuel for creativity. I mean, we know that well. How many songs and art has been produced on the basis of all these mental afflictions? But what we're talking about here is the source of creativity. Where does creativity come from? It's not coming from mental afflictions. Because actually, as long as our mind is caught up in mental afflictions, such as craving, jealousy, and attachment, and anger, and so forth, we are suffocating our creative talent. And creativity comes through more when our mind is quiet and still. And we know that from our own experience. So if we can reduce our craving and attachment and other mental afflictions, we allow that space for creativity to naturally emerge. And again, this has been my experience in retreat, is you're meditating, and then as your mind settles down, it becomes more quiet and still. And I'm not a very creative person, but what you find is all of a sudden, all these fantastic ideas just keep popping up out of nowhere. Out of nowhere, seemingly. You're not trying to solve a problem, they're just, boof, here they come. Because you've allowed that space for them to come through. And also, often when we're creative, our motivation is a bit dubious sometimes. You know, often we produce some creative music or art and we go, look at that, look at me, I'm a very good artist, aren't I? Whereas I think the truly great creative people are the ones who don't use that to sort of boost the ego, but they use their creative talents to inspire other people for a good purpose. And so if we reduce our mental afflictions, not only will we become much more creative than we've ever been in our entire life, but we'll become more creative for a more worthwhile reason. So basically what I'm saying is, if we reduce and eliminate attachment, we'll enjoy the simple pleasures way more than we've ever done. Our relationships will improve and we'll become more creative for a more meaningful reason. So win, 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 get rid of attachment. But again, don't expect by next week that we've got rid of attachment. That will not happen. It'll be a lifelong thing, but the more we can reduce it, the better everything will be. So that's my plug for reducing attachment. Any questions about that? Otherwise, I'll talk a little bit about compassion now.
Yeah, there's a little bit like potential for feeling guilt when you're saying get rid of, because when I imagine myself noticing, okay, I'm very attached, okay, I'm bad. Like,
so this is
probably not so happy, I guess.
So this is actually the exact topic I want to talk about now with compassion. this guilt, low self-esteem thing and that's one of the, exactly the point I want to talk about now with compassion. So we can hold off on that, but is there any other questions about loving kindness or attachment before we go there?
I have a commentary because I'm an artist, and now when you ask for intention, then I was making intention to clear the space for creativity, and so then you have spent a lot of time about creativity, so I'm very grateful for this.
There we go. See? Very good.
Towards the target.
Yeah, I mean, I do not consider myself creative at all, but my experience is when I go and retreat, I mean, just so much ideas come up. It's just, sometimes you're completely surprised because you're not trying to solve anything. It's just maybe some time in the past you set some intention that I'd like to know about that or solve that, and you've forgotten about it, and all of a sudden, boof, there comes the answer. And in fact, that's what I do often now is if I've got some things I'm thinking about, I immediately just stop thinking about them. I just go into meditation and quieten the mind. And I'm not trying to answer the questions or anything. I just go into meditation, quiet the mind. 9 times out of 10 now, very quickly, poof, up comes the answer. And it's a more authentic answer, generally, because often the intellectual mind can be very tricky. You know, it's like the little bit like the devil on your shoulder whispering things into your ear. And so the intellectual mind, sometimes when you're trying to solve a problem, the intellectual mind goes, this is the answer, when in fact it's just something to sort of boost the ego. Whereas if you drop all of that, the answer that comes from deep down is much more genuine and authentic, not a big ego trip. Often, not always, but most often. Okay. So the second of the 4 immeasurables is compassion. In Sanskrit and Pali is karuna. And compassion here is defined as the wish for ourselves and others to be free of suffering and its causes. So again, what we can immediately see here is, like loving kindness, the way compassion is defined in Buddhism, it's not an emotion. It's an aspiration. Because what is key, certainly from a Buddhist perspective, is not the emotion that we display, but what's underlying the emotion. What's the intention that manifests in a certain emotional way? That's the key, not how emotional we get, but what is the driving force behind that. So again, here compassion is this intention, is this wish for ourselves and others to be free of suffering and its causes. And again, like loving kindness, it's recommended to develop that in stages: friend, stranger, difficult person, all living beings. But again, I think in our modern society, we need to add one step at the beginning and be compassionate toward ourselves. If we're not kind and compassionate to ourselves, it's almost impossible to cultivate that to others. And so this comes to the question here then about guilt that I'd like to address. And it covers 2 points here actually, is often when we're cultivating the compassion, generally compassion to friends is pretty easy. Compassion to strangers, okay, we can usually sort of manage that. But then when it comes to compassion to the difficult person, particularly to that nasty, horrible person that behaves very badly, intentionally behaves very badly, compassion to them, I don't think so. In fact, they don't deserve compassion because they're horrible, nasty people, so they deserve to suffer. No? So the question is, why is it difficult to have compassion for them? And similarly, sometimes people find it much more easy to have compassion to their friends and even strangers than themselves. And why is that? The same reason. I don't deserve compassion because I'm just a horrible, nasty person. So, and this is one of my favorite topics And there's a simple answer to this question. You know, why is there this epidemic of low self-esteem, guilt and self-hatred in our modern society? And why do we find it almost impossible to develop compassion for these so-called nasty people? And it all comes down to the same thing. So if someone's behaving badly, the correct perspective is to see there's a person doing or engaging in a bad or harmful action or behaviour. So that's the correct perspective. But often, when we see someone behaving badly, we don't adopt this perspective. Rather, we have this perspective. There's a bad person. There's a nasty person, horrible person. So what we've done here is we have stuck the person and the behaviour together. We've made them one thing. And in psychology, this is called cognitive fusion. And this is, of course, an invalid perspective. Because there are two things here. There's a person and there's a behaviour. And so if we do this cognitive fusion, and our language and way of speaking is pervaded by speaking in this way, so we've basically been primed, since we were this high, to have this sort of perspective. And so not only is it an invalid false perspective, it has very bad side effects, adopting this perspective. If in any given situation, we've got two choices, accept or reject. And generally, if someone's behaving badly, we reject, as we should. But the unfortunate thing is, if we do cognitive fusion and we reject, because we've fused the behaviour to the person, what reject translates into is attacking the person, getting angry at the person. The thing, of course, that we don't like is their behaviour. But when we fuse it to the person, then rejecting the behaviour translates into attacking the person, getting angry at the person. And of course, this is not useful. It doesn't help. It usually often makes the situation worse, because then they react, they attack you, you attack them more, it just gets out of control. And we're not even addressing the bad behaviour here, because we're directing at the person. Whereas the thing, what we want to do is we want to direct it at the behaviour, but that's not doing that. So it's completely useless, it just makes the thing worse. And then the other thing, of course, is if we understand that this is not helpful, then we've said, okay, reject is not a good option, accept. But then, of course, we end up accepting their bad behaviour. Because basically these are the only two options available if we do cognitive fusion. Either we attack the person or we accept the bad behaviour. And both of those, of course, are not very helpful. They're not a good response. And it's even worse than that if we do cognitive fusion. Because then, when it comes to compassion or forgiveness, if we do cognitive fusion, it becomes almost impossible, because having forgiveness or compassion for a bad person, a horrible person, a nasty person, feels like what we're saying is, oh, what you did is okay, I don't mind. Of course we should mind. But that's why it feels like they don't deserve forgiveness or compassion because they're a bad person. And it's even worse than that, because if we do this cognitive fusion and we see them as a bad person, then it becomes almost impossible to acknowledge any good qualities or good behaviour that they do. The fact is, everyone sometimes does good things and sometimes does bad things. But if we see the person as a bad person, bad people do not do good things. Which means if they do something good, we brush it off and go, oh, they didn't mean it because they're a bad person. So we can't acknowledge any of their good qualities or good behaviour. So we end up with a fixed, biased, false view of that person. How often do we see that? Often it only takes one thing. Maybe that person generally is always doing something good, but they do one thing bad. We do this, and that's it. That's what the label they have maybe for the rest of their life. That's a bad person, bad person, bad person. Maybe they only did one bad thing in their entire life, but we've branded them as a bad person. That's it. No wonder we have family feuds or feuds with neighbours and stuff, because we've done this, and that's what sticks in our mind. They're a bad person. Okay, it was 10 years ago they did something bad, but I'm sure they're still bad, you know. And it's a disaster. It's not helpful. So of course the solution to all of this is don't do cognitive fusion, because it's a false, invalid perspective. There are two things here. There's a person and there's a behaviour. So if we adopt the correct perspective and simply acknowledge there's a person doing a bad and harmful action, then we can accept the person, i.e. have compassion for the person, and at the same time reject their negative behaviour and address their negative behaviour and help them to overcome that negative behaviour and not tolerate that negative behaviour. And the same goes for ourselves. And this goes on to the question here of guilt. If we do a negative behaviour, the correct perspective is simply acknowledge, I did this negative, bad action. But again, generally, we don't have that perspective. If we do something negative or bad, I'm a bad person. Same consequences. We end up attacking ourselves. We end up with this fixed, biased view. I'm just a bad person. So then the guilt thing comes in. And then, of course, forgiveness and compassion for ourselves. I don't deserve it. I'm a bad person. Self-hatred, because I'm just a bad person. So again, the solution to guilt, low self-esteem and self-hatred is stop doing cognitive fusion, because it's an invalid, false perspective. Is simply acknowledge, I did this harmful thing. And this is the difference between regret and guilt. If we've done something harmful or bad and we feel guilty, what are we focusing on? Bad me. So guilt comes from cognitive fusion. It's coming from a false perspective. So it's completely useless. All it does is it makes us feel bad and it paralyzes us. So we don't need to feel guilty about anything. Because one, it's not helpful, and two, it's coming from a completely invalid false perspective. Whereas if we have done something harmful and we regret, where does regret come from? This. Acknowledging I've done a bad behaviour and regretting that behaviour and looking to overcome that negative behaviour. Whereas guilt is not even looking at the negative behaviour, just paralyzes us and makes us feel bad. End up with low self-esteem and self-hatred, which is completely useless. Whereas if we adopt the correct perspective, we can have forgiveness and compassion for ourselves and at the same time not tolerate our negative behaviour, regret that negative behaviour and look at overcoming that negative behaviour. So I think this is something, if we understand it, can be very helpful in terms of overcoming low self-esteem, guilt, self-hatred, and also helping us to develop compassion even for people who behave badly. Any questions about this? And then otherwise I think it's time for a break.
thinking, I'm not completely finished with this thought, but I can feel this projection you do when you might have a
This what, sorry, projection?
Yeah, you had a shadow, you know, you have bad qualities yourself, and then you project it out to the other. So I'm kind of looking at this, trying to see what is happening there and how this could be applied to this structure you are presenting.
Sure.
Kind of.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
I'm not ready with it.
Okay.
I just wanted to
Sure. Of course, here, with this, adopting the correct perspective, of course, we also need to have wisdom. So we need wisdom and compassion always together in any situation. So it's not simply good enough to be compassionate or to have wisdom, and we need both. So part of the wisdom here is to have what's called discriminating wisdom and to as best evaluate as possible whether that action is unethical or not. And of course, sometimes we make a mistake, but we learn from that. But if we have whatever level of compassion we can manage and wisdom and doing this and not this, that's all we can do in any given situation.
I have a question. I think it's related with the cognitive vision, but
Sure.
anyway, it has to do in something that I feel that I attract. It's like I don't like to choose sides when friends they have an issue. Sometimes in the environment that I live, I feel kind of a pressure to choose sides.
Sure.
So I always make it clear to choose sides.
Right.
In some cases, certain people who I deny to choose side, they do passive aggression and hostility of showing that you didn't stay with me, so I will.
Sure. Exactly. And I think this is a good question. And I think this choosing sides, if we look at it closely, it only comes from this. Choosing sides doesn't come from this, because this means we choose everyone on our side. And what we're discriminating here is behavior. Whereas choosing sides is, I'm the good guy, you're the bad guy. Or we're the good guys, you lot are the bad guys, which is all cognitive fusion. So choosing sides is symptomatic of cognitive fusion. So another great problem with cognitive fusion is it causes division in people. And it's terrible how we use this language and why that causes so much division in our world. You know, like even, you know, just the term, we're the good ones, they're the bad, they're the evil ones. I mean, even like using the word terrorist is not helpful. We can say that person did a terrorist act. That's helpful because then we can condemn that behavior and try and help that person. But as soon as we do things like terrorist or bad people, good people, we're in trouble. We're in trouble. And it's not helpful. All it does is it creates more divide, more problems. It doesn't solve anything. Whereas if we don't pick sides and we do this, then we're all on the same side. There's no sides. And what we're doing is not dividing people into groups, the good ones and the bad ones, the evil ones. We are evaluating everyone's behavior. And when it's not acceptable, when we look at that and we don't tolerate that, regardless of the person. So I think if we use, when there's conflict, if we use this language, we can be accepting of everyone. But if one of those people is behaving badly, we can condemn that behavior. So we accept everyone, but we evaluate behavior. Otherwise, picking sides is really just this.
Yeah.
And it just creates more conflict and fights.
But when it comes to, for example, the person who denies to choose sides is in a very fragile situation that can, example, lose job or something like that.
Sorry?
When the person who doesn't want to choose side is in a fragile position that he cannot be, but he doesn't accept to be manipulated, and this hostility and passive aggression can lead to lose job or something.
Right. And again, not choosing sides is symptomatic of this. And by not choosing sides, we're still buying into this, which also doesn't work. So choosing side or not choosing side is all coming from this, and both of those is not helpful. Yeah. Choosing or not choosing. The solution is to get out of the idea, do I choose or not, the side, because having sides is the problem. If we do this, then we accept everyone, but we don't tolerate anyone's bad behavior. And the thing is, when we are addressing those very difficult situations where someone's behaving badly, if we do this, if the person does not our friend, we instantly do this. If it's our friend and we think, oh, I better not do that, what do? We do this, don't we? Because that's the two options. And if they're our friend and they're behaving badly, we don't want to do that, because then they won't be our friend anymore. And so what we do is this, which is equally bad. So the solution is not, do I get angry at my friend or do I just let that bad behavior slip without saying anything? Both options are not helpful, because both options are coming from an invalid perspective. So if we adopt this perspective, then even with our friends who behave badly, if we use this way of speaking, we can be very strong with their behavior, even though they're our friend. And because we're having compassion for the person and the way of speaking, I think they can sense that we're caring for them. We're trying to help them. And then we can really try and help them with their bad behavior. So it's not like, oh, I don't want to get angry at my friend, but therefore I'll forget about what they did. I mean, that's not helpful, either of those. But if we do this, that's basically the only two choices we've got. So we end up picking sides. We either go against them or we go with them in this way. And both are not helpful. And the problem is this. But that's the tough decision that we're basically forced into by doing this. So again, the solution is not choose one of those, but to stop doing this. And then we can really be very strong with our friend if they're behaving badly, and at the same time we can have a very compassionate attitude. And I think if we use that language, they can sense it. Like here, we're directing at the person. And they don't like that. Even if they've behaved badly, if you direct your hostility at the person, of course they're going to react. Whereas if you direct at their behavior, and instead of saying you're a horrible person, instead of saying that, you say you realize this behavior is very destructive, very harmful, then I think they can sense that you're caring for them and they may listen to what you're saying. At least you have a better chance than doing this, because this is not going to work.
I was just wondering if there's also, I guess there's also another fusion going on in terms of what is causing the behavior. Is it, so the cause of the bad behavior in turn is the afflictions.
Exactly.
And then you also fuse with the afflictions.
Yeah.
And then you have another problem.
Yeah, exactly. So this cognitive fusion we do in many different ways. It's not just person and behavior, but the same, as you said, is that, and this comes up in often Buddhist texts like Shantideva, you know. The classic example I think given in the text is, you know, if someone does something bad to us, we get angry at the person, but then Shantideva in his text says, well, hang on, why are you getting angry at the person? And he gives the example, like if someone, because the person is the direct cause of your problem, but if someone hits you with a stick, do you get angry at the stick? Because it's actually the stick that harmed you directly. And then Shantideva says, well, you never get angry at the stick because you understand it's the person who's wielding the stick, who's driving the stick. So you get angry at the thing driving what directly harms you. Similarly, the person maybe directly harms you, but Why get angry at them? Because what's driving them is their mental afflictions, is their anger, is their negative state of mind. That's what's driving the person to say bad things about you. So similarly, then you should get angry at what's driving the person and not the person. So again, this is a classic example of cognitive fusion. One last point, and then we really need to take a break. Generally, this cognitive fusion gets us into trouble because we're identifying ourselves and others with our negative emotion, negative habits, negative behavior. But equally well, we need to avoid cognitive fusion with positive behavior. And unfortunately, you know, the question before was low self-esteem and self-hatred, which is epidemic in our modern society. But unfortunately, some modern therapies, as a solution to that, they go to the other extreme. To overcome low self-esteem, self-hatred, they say, just tell yourself you're a special person. Disaster. It's an absolute disaster. I mean, really, it's just a disaster waiting to happen. Because you're identifying yourself with some positive behavioral quality, and if you use that, you program that, I'm a special person, two things will happen. First, probably, yes, actually I am a special person. I'm actually better than everyone else, which is a disaster. And then, on top of that, when you find that you can't live up to that label of special person, you plummet even deeper into low self-esteem and even further into self-hatred. Because I've just confirmed that actually I'm not a special person, which I thought I might have been, through my behavior. So I must be really a horrible person. So you just end up going deeper into the other direction. So the solution to low self-esteem and self-hatred is not to pump yourself up thinking you're special or fantastic or whatever, because that's just going to create all sorts of ego trip and boosting arrogance and pride that we're better than everyone else. The solution is just stop cognitive fusion. And then you can feel good about yourself regardless of your behavior. So that's important. So if someone else does something wonderful, good behavior, please do not praise that person, because it's probably going to end up in an ego trip. Oh yes, everyone's praising me. I must be wonderful. I'm special. But what you must do instead of that is praise their behavior. Don't praise the person. Praise their behavior, because if you praise their behavior, that'll motivate them to continue to do the good behavior. Similarly, if you do something good, do not praise yourself. It'll just be an ego trip, but you must praise your behavior. If you praise your behavior, you'll feel good about yourself, and that'll motivate you to continue doing that good behavior. So, unfortunately, in our modern society, we have so much focus on the negative. So much. And not only do we focus on the negative with respect to our others, we do that with cognitive fusion. So no wonder there's an epidemic of hate, anger, low self-esteem, guilt, self-hatred in our modern society. Because we're always focusing on the negative. You look at it in the news and the media, it's just negative, negative, negative. And we focus on the negative with cognitive fusion. You know, those nasty, horrible people, blah, blah, blah. So therefore, we need to balance that, which is the third of the four immeasurables, which I'll talk about after the break, empathetic joy, which is focusing on the positive, but not with cognitive fusion. It's a rejoicing in our own and others' good behavior and virtues and so forth. And we must do that to balance. And very last point, and then we'll take a break, is this is very much highlighted. I read they did a study about this obsession with negative. And they had couples, and they did this experiment where one of the couple would do a certain level of negative behavior towards their partner. And so you would expect, logically speaking, that to negate that, to balance it, the partner would have to do sort of equal positive opposite behavior to sort of nullify. Sounds logical, no? No? Sounds reasonable, doesn't it? If you do a certain level of negative behavior to sort of balance that, if you do the equal opposite positive, it should sort of balance it. No? Sounds reasonable? The study showed no way. No way. The study showed that if a partner did a certain level of negative behavior toward their partner, to balance that, to nullify that, the person had to do 4 or 5 equivalent positive opposite behaviors to have a balancing effect. That's how much we're focused on the negative. I mean, disaster.
It's in you. Who decides what's good or bad behavior? That's also hard, I think, because you're coming from your viewpoint.
Sure.
Someone else is doing something
Sure,
bad.
sure. And exactly. And as I said, we have to use our discriminating wisdom. And of course, we're not omniscient. We do the best we can. From a Buddhist and we learn from our mistakes, of course. But from a Buddhist perspective, the underlying source of ethical behavior is the interconnected nature of reality, the interdependent nature of reality. And so if we're doing something against that interconnectedness, then it's unethical. I mean, how to know whether it's not so easy, but at least with that understanding, then we can sort of try to work out whether certain behavior is unethical or not. That's our guideline, not someone sort of making up an arbitrary list which may be culturally dependent and so forth. Okay, let's have half-hour break, I think. Okay. Before we go on to the last 2 of the 4 immeasurables, empathetic joy, equanimity, I thought it'd be good to start with a meditation where we can actually combine the cultivation of loving kindness and compassion into one meditation. So let's do that now. As always, we begin by preparing the body, setting the body into a state of relaxation, stillness, and vigilance. So a vigilant posture is to keep the back nice and straight. And at the same time allow the entire body to become completely relaxed, completely at ease. Using the out-breath to relax and release any tightness or tension in any part of the body. And relaxing more deeply with each out-breath. And with each out-breath, letting go of any thoughts that may have arisen, happily releasing them. And simply allow the mind to come to rest in the present moment through focusing on the sensations of the breath throughout the body. Wherever you can most easily notice any sensations associated with the breathing. So let's now engage in what's called Tonglen practice. Tonglen is a Tibetan word meaning giving and taking. And it's a very powerful method to transform our normal attachments and aversions into loving kindness and compassion. So we can begin by focusing on ourselves first, and then expanding out to include others. No matter how much mental afflictions are in our mind, so no matter how much craving and jealousy, anger, resentment, frustration and so forth are in our mind, these are not part of the nature of our mind. They're merely like dirt covering the surface of our mind. And beneath all these mental afflictions is the natural purity of our mind. So imagine this inner purity of your mind in the form of a small, white, radiant sphere of light in the center of your chest, at the level of your heart. And then arouse the thought, how wonderful it would be if I were free of suffering and its causes. May I be free of all suffering and its causes. May I be free of all mental afflictions. And then imagine your mental afflictions and suffering in the form of black smoke filling your body. And then with each in-breath, imagine drawing that black smoke into the sphere of light at your heart, completely dissolving it there. So with each in-breath, breathe in with compassion, dissolving and extinguishing your mental afflictions and suffering at your heart. Dissolving it into the inner purity of your mind, your inner wisdom. And then imagine now the black cloud is completely extinguished. And now you're completely free of all mental afflictions and suffering. And then arouse the thought, how wonderful it would be if I had happiness and its causes. May I be truly well and happy. And then with each out-breath, imagine immeasurable rays of light radiating out from the sphere of light at your heart, filling and saturating your entire body and mind. Imagining it transforming into everything you need to be happy in the short term and the long term. So with each out-breath, breathe out the light of loving kindness, sending to yourself whatever you need to be happy. And then imagine that you've now found the genuine happiness that you seek. And just as you wish to be free of suffering and find genuine happiness, so does everyone else. So now allow your field of loving kindness and compassion to expand out to the person seated next to you. They are just like yourself in wanting to be happy and wanting to be free of suffering. So arouse the thought, how wonderful it would be if they are free of suffering and its causes. May you be free of all suffering and its causes. And then imagine their mental afflictions and suffering in the form of black smoke filling their body. And with each in-breath, imagine drawing that black smoke out of their body and bringing it into the sphere of light at your heart, completely dissolving it there. So with each in-breath, breathe in with compassion, dissolving and extinguishing their suffering at your heart. And then imagine that they're now completely free of all suffering and its causes. And take joy in this. And then arouse the thought, how wonderful it would be if they had happiness and its causes. May you be truly well and happy. And then with each out-breath, imagine rays of light radiating out from your heart, filling their body and mind, and transforming into everything they need to be happy. So with each out-breath, breathe out the light of loving kindness, sending to them whatever they need to be happy, in the short term and the long term. And then imagine that they've now found the true happiness that is their heart's desire. And rejoice in this. And then allow your field of loving kindness and compassion to expand out further. And allow your mind to move around. And whoever comes to mind, whether it's a friend, a stranger, or even someone who you find a bit difficult, bring them to mind, attend to them. May you be free of suffering and its causes. May you be truly well and happy. And then with each in-breath, breathe in with compassion, dissolving and extinguishing their suffering at your heart. And with each out-breath, breathe out the light of loving kindness, sending to them whatever they need to be happy. And allow your mind to continue to move around. Whoever comes to mind, whether it's an individual or even a group of people, attend to them, breathing in with compassion, dissolving and extinguishing their suffering at your heart, and breathing out the light of loving kindness, sending to them whatever they need to be happy. And then we can bring the meditation to a close. So let's briefly look at the last two of the four immeasurables. So we've looked at loving kindness and compassion. Remember, loving kindness is the wish for ourselves and others to have happiness in its causes. So immeasurable loving kindness is the wish for all living beings to have happiness in its causes. Whereas immeasurable compassion is the wish for all living beings to be free of suffering and its causes. So again, both loving kindness and compassion here are not emotions, they're aspirations, they're a wish or aspiration for ourselves and others to be either free of suffering or to have happiness. And as I mentioned before the break, in our modern society, we have this obsession with the negative. And not only do we have an obsession with the negative, always focusing on the negative, we tend to do that with cognitive fusion. So to help balance that obsession with the negative, balance that a little bit, one, of course, stop doing the cognitive fusion, but on top of that is also focus on the positive aspects of ourselves and others. Because as I think modern day philosopher William James has said, what we attend to becomes our reality. And so if we're always attending to the negative, that becomes our reality. Even if we're attending to the negative from the perspective of, I don't want that, that's what we're still focusing on. So, for example, a classic example is if we want to give up smoking, there's no point in saying, I don't want to smoke. I mean, it's a disaster because what we're attending to is smoking, so we're going to continue to smoke. The mind doesn't register the negation. The focus is smoking, so that's where we're stuck. So similarly, in any field, if we have a difficulty, don't focus on that from the perspective of, I don't want that, because that's your focus. Focus on the positive opposite. So if you want to give up smoking, don't say, I don't want to smoke. Say, I want a healthy body. I want healthy lungs. That's what your focus is. Similarly, I think it was Mother Teresa said once, she would never attend an anti-war rally, but she would always attend a peace rally. So I think we have so much focus on the negative, and then when we want to get away from that, what do? Is we say, I don't want that. I mean, that's not going to help, because that's what we're focusing on. We need to focus on the positive opposite of that. And the positive opposite here is empathetic joy, is a rejoicing in the virtues and positive behavior of ourselves and others. But again, here we need to avoid cognitive fusion, as I mentioned before, the break. Is if someone is behaving in a good way or we've done something good, do not praise the person. It's just going to become an ego trip for that person or for yourself if you're focusing on yourself. But you must praise their behavior. You must praise your own behavior because we have so much obsessive focus on the negative. And so therefore, I think this is imperative. We do this empathetic joy to balance that obsession out. And again, praise the behavior. Do not praise the person. Praise your own behavior if you've done something good. Do not praise yourself. It's not going to help. And so this is empathetic joy. And I think a good way to do this, of course, whenever you see someone behaving in a good way, if you can verbalize that, great. If not, you can mentally rejoice in their behavior. And just mentally rejoice in the good things that that person is doing. And similarly with yourself, you don't have to verbalize it, but at least mentally rejoice in the good things you do. And I think a practical way of doing that is at the end of every day, I think it's before we go to sleep, it's good to do a little bit of a review of how our day went. And we can do two things here. Is we can look at any negative things we've done during the day, but again, maybe to keep it short, so maybe 1 or 2 or 3 most, 1 or 2 maybe negative things, but do not do cognitive fusion because you're just going to start beating yourself up. But what we can do is acknowledge, I did that not so good thing this morning, and then develop regret, have sincere regret. I regret having done that. Tomorrow I'm going to make sure I'm not going to do that thing again. So make a strong determination not to do it again, and that will start to break those negative habits. But equally important, maybe even more important, at the end of the day, when you review the day, look at the good things you did during the day and look at the good things other people did during the day and rejoice. Do this empathetic joy. Rejoice in a couple of things. Maybe again, keep it short, otherwise it becomes too much of a thing to do every day and you'll not do it. But maybe the top 1 or 2 things that you did during the day and rejoice in that, not in yourself, in that behavior. And be happy about that behavior and make a strong determination to continue that good behavior the following day. And that's going to strengthen your positive habits. So if you do that little exercise, and it could take 30 seconds each evening, that's a very effective way of reducing negative habits, increasing positive habits, and then having a balanced view of ourselves and not this obsession about negative behavior. Because that's often the case with ourselves and others. You know, maybe 5% or less is negative, but that's what we focus on. So if someone else does 95% good things during the day and 5% not so good, we say, oh, they're a horrible, bad person. And same with us. We maybe do 95% very good things during the day, 5% maybe not so good, and that's what we focus on. Oh, I was a bad person today. Disaster. So I think this can be very helpful for that. Last thing, equanimity, and then maybe some general discussion. Equanimity here empathetic joy in Sanskrit and Pali is mudita. Equanimity is upeksha in Sanskrit and Pali. And equanimity here is, as the name suggests, is balance, is unbiased attitude towards everyone. Now, our attitude towards others tends to be very biased. And we tend to categorize people into 3 groups, depending on how they affect us. So we tend to have this very narrow perspective on any situation. How is this situation affecting me? And then anyone around us who seem to be supporting me in my happiness, we tend to label friend. And those people around us who don't seem to affect me in my happiness in any way, we tend to label stranger. And the people around us who seem to be interfering with me in my happiness and maybe even seem to be causing me suffering, we label the so-called enemy. So we categorize people into these 3 groups depending solely on the perspective of how they affect me. And then, of course, based on that categorization, we have very biased attitude. Because towards the friend who we labeled that simply because they seem to be the source of my happiness, we have a lot of attachment to them. To the group who we label stranger because they don't seem to be affecting me in any way, we often develop a lot of apathy, indifference. Couldn't care less what happens to them because they're not affecting me in any way. And then the group we've labeled the so-called enemy because they seem to be interfering with me in my happiness, maybe even causing me suffering, aversion, hostility, anger, hatred. So we end up with attachment to friends, apathy to strangers, aversion, anger, hatred to the difficult people. Equanimity is about overcoming this biased attitude by understanding that we are all in the same situation. We're all trying to be happy. We're all trying to be free of suffering. We're all equal in this regard. And then reflecting in this way, we can develop a sense of closeness to everyone. that we're all stuck in the same situation. Again, if we do cognitive fusion, this will be impossible to do. If we avoid cognitive fusion, it's a lot easier. We're all in the same situation. As His Holiness Dalai Lama is always commenting that we need to focus on similarities, not differences. Because by focusing on differences, we end up with cognitive fusion. We're the good guys, they're the bad guys, creates problems, big mess. If we focus on similarities, we're all humans, we're all living on the same planet, we all want to be happy, we all want to be free of suffering, then there's not us versus them. And then we can develop this mind of equanimity, which of course is the basis for really developing these other three qualities toward everyone equally. Any questions about any of these four immeasurables? There's one more thing I want to briefly talk about before we finish this evening, but if there's any questions now. Okay. Actually, there's, yeah, go
I
on.
think it would be nice if you formulate, we were discussing it also by the tea out there, to get structure to formulate, you know, when I'm good or the other is having good behavior. I mean, can you give examples of...
What do you mean by structure to formulate? In what sense? In the way of talking, or...?
Yeah, this you did good, or how should you address it in your mind to get out of this fusion, negative fusion?
Yeah, again, I think a very good thing to do, again, is we have to reprogram the way we think and speak, because
Yes.
we've been programmed to speak in cognitive fusion way and
Yes.
think like that since we're this high. So it takes reprogramming.
Yeah.
And one thing that I think is very helpful that I find is simply focus on the behavior.
Yes.
I mean, you don't even have to reference the person. You can simply say, that was great behavior.
Yeah.
Even better for ourselves is, that was great behavior. You don't have to say, I did that great thing.
Yes.
You can simply think, that was wonderful behavior.
Yes.
And then it can be, oh, I did that, or they did that, doesn't matter.
Yeah.
That was great behavior.
Yeah. Yeah.
And think in that way.
Yeah.
And I think I find, it's a thing I look at a lot, is particularly in the earlier days when you used to write things, write letters and that, is have a look at how often we use the pronoun I, me and my.
It's terrible.
But this is one way of reprogramming, is instead of saying, I went on a wonderful holiday, you can say, the holiday was wonderful. You can forget about the I.
Yeah.
So this is very helpful.
Yeah.
This is very helpful because that's the subject matter, is the holiday. The fact that you were part of that is incidental.
Yeah.
But we always put me first.
Yeah.
I did this. I went there. I.
Yeah.
Disaster.
Yeah.
So this is one way of programming.
Yeah.
And similarly, you can do this with others to help avoid them being obsessed about themselves. If they've done something good, you don't have to say, you did a wonderful thing. You can just say, wow, that was a wonderful thing to do. That was a wonderful thing to do.
Yeah.
You're not even mentioning you.
Yeah.
I mean, it's obvious, but
Yeah.
by not mentioning it, the focus is the activity, not the person who's doing the activity. So that's even going to be more helpful for them. Oh, I did that wonderful thing. If you just say, that was a wonderful thing to do. So I think the key here is if we can just leave out the agent in the way of speaking, it's the best. Because then there can't be cognitive fusion because there's no agent mentioned. It's just activity. I mean, sometimes it's a bit awkward, but if we can do that when that would be the best.
So if I would say now, this is excellent ideas.
Exactly.
Yes.
Instead of you had an excellent idea, or you're, even worse than that would be, you're fantastic person because you had these excellent ideas. I mean, that would be, you're such an imaginative, wonderful person. That would be the worst. But the best is, again, Wow, that's some wonderful ideas there. Talk about the object, the agent, instead of the agent.
I was thinking also that the same behavior takes on a different meaning, as in, you know, I praise the person, or the stranger praised the person, or Donald Trump praised the person. It's like the same action, and you know, positive actions in all cases, but you know, we'll view them very, same action will be viewed very differently.
Sure, sure. Of course, absolutely. Anything else?
I noticed for a while ago I was practicing this rejoicing of what I have done and what others have done. It was very easy. We really need to be very careful with the words. Then I know, at least I have done one good thing.
At least.
I have this.
Yeah. Okay, one last to round up this evening. Again, these near enemies, I just want to run through them briefly, because what we find here is that each one of these has what's called this near enemy, something that sort of masquerades as that quality and actually is opposite and creates problems. And if we don't identify the near enemy, this quality will be polluted and corrupted by that near enemy. And the one we've looked at briefly already is loving kindness. Of course, the near enemy is attachment. Now, fortunately, one of the other of the four immeasurables acts as an antidote to the near enemy. So, for example, here, if we see that our loving kindness is degenerating simply into attachment, what's good to do is reflect on equanimity. Because equanimity is to overcome attachment to friends, but also apathy to strangers and aversion that. So, again, if we see that our loving kindness is simply being corrupted and degenerating into attachment, that's a good time to reflect and work on equanimity as an antidote to that. But of course, also equanimity has a near enemy. And the near enemy of equanimity is something that looks like equanimity, but is actually opposite and creates problems for equanimity, is and this is very common, you know. People go, I've got equanimity, but actually they're just completely indifferent to everyone. I mean, that's equal, but it's not equanimity. I'm equally indifferent to everyone. Because equanimity is equal attitude, but it's this sense of closeness to everyone. Whereas indifference is, I couldn't care less about anyone, equally. So if we see our equanimity is degenerating into simply being indifferent to everyone and everything, then it's good time to reflect on compassion. Because it becomes more difficult to be indifferent when you see suffering, others suffer. Then it's difficult to be indifferent. Compassion has its own near enemy, and the near enemy of compassion is despair. You know, we're attending to suffering, but it's overwhelming us and we just feel, it feels hopeless. And this often happens because, again, we have this obsession with focusing on the negative. And then it becomes, oh, it's too much. So, of course, if that starts to happen, if compassion just degenerates into despair, then it's a good time, of course, to reflect on empathetic joy, reflect on the positive. Because again, what we attend to becomes our reality. So if we're always attending to suffering, then of course it's going to be, this will probably follow. But empathetic joy also has its own near enemy. And again, empathetic joy is a rejoicing in our own and others' virtues and good behaviour. But of course here this rejoicing can become quite rejoicing in meaningless things, and even to the point of sometimes rejoicing when others are suffering. That's, in German it's called Schadenfreude, you know, so that would be the extreme case. But here the near enemy would be just rejoicing in things that are not meaningful. So what's often called frivolous rejoicing, rejoicing for no good reason.
It would be like New Age.
New age happiness.
Probably. So if we find that our rejoicing is degenerating into just meaningless rejoicing, then it's good to reflect on loving kindness, because loving kindness is focusing on the wish for ourselves and others to find that genuine happiness and its causes. So this is how each of the four immeasurables can help work as an antidote to the near enemy for each one. So that's the last thing I wanted to talk about today. We've nearly run out of time, but if there's any last questions, then ask away.
I thought that the near enemy of compassion was pity.
Pity, yeah, I mean it can be a very similar thing here, in that because pity, in fact, I think pity is one of these words like sympathy, which my understanding is earlier in the English language, like a couple hundred years ago, it was actually quite a positive flavour, but now it's sort of changed in meaning. And I think both pity and sympathy now again tend to be based on cognitive fusion, like I'm okay, you're not okay, I'm better, you're down there. You know, poor you.
It's like then there is no compassion.
No, it's not really compassion. So, so that's the case. I think also particularly this word sympathy now has, in the last, I think, 200 years, has sort of changed in meaning, and it's more like poor you, you down there, me up here sort of thing. And I think pity is the same in that sense. So for that, for pity, of course, then I think equanimity would be the solution, because we're all putting ourselves at the same level. So if we find that it's becoming pity, then it's really about equanimity because equanimity means saying we're all equal in wanting to be happy, wanting to be free of suffering. I'm no more important than anyone else.
I'm thinking more like, because I sort of work with social work, and there's a lot of people, they think they have compassion, but they have pity. And they are always doing this separation. And when they do the separation, they cannot really understand the situation of the person and then really help them.
Yeah. And I think here, from a Buddhist perspective, to really cultivate compassion effectively, we need to have a little bit the wisdom wing, because compassion is the wish for ourselves and others to be free of suffering and its causes. But if we don't see the possibility to be free of suffering and its causes, you can't develop compassion. No? You know, if there's suffering, but you see that there's no hope to be liberated from that, then it's impossible. How could you develop the wish to be free of it if you believe there's no way that you can be free of it? Then compassion is not possible.
And then you become desperate.
Then that also can help to lead to desperation, because there's so much suffering and there's nothing we can do about it. It's a mess. So again, this is a case where the wisdom, compassion really needs to come together, because here the wisdom is really understanding that the underlying source of suffering is the mental afflictions in our mind, the underlying source, and that we can do something about them, we can eliminate them. So if we know that, then we can develop compassion because we can understand, yes, there's a lot of suffering, physically or mentally, but there is a way to overcome it. There's hope. And so then we can have that aspiration for ourselves and others to be free of it. Otherwise, we can mouth the words, but if we really believe there's no way we can really be free of suffering in others, then the compassion is just hollow words. Then it can become despair or maybe pity in terms of no hope. And one point, we often talk about compassion burnout. Technically, that's not possible. Technically, it's empathy burnout. Because empathy is a connecting with others' suffering. But if that empathy is not conjoined with wisdom and understanding there's a chance to overcome that suffering, then it can become overwhelming. No? So when we say compassion burnout, from a Buddhist perspective, technically it's too much empathy without wisdom. You can never have compassion burnout.
Compassion has also limits. It doesn't have that kind of limit. I don't mean that kind of limit. It's limitless. But
Exactly.
But it has the boundaries. It doesn't let someone just eat you up unless you are a big master.
But again, technically, compassion is simply the aspiration for ourselves and others to be free of suffering. You can never get burnt out from that aspiration. What you can get burnt out from is cognitive fusion, identifying with that suffering and getting overwhelmed by that and seeing no hope. That can lead to what's called compassion burnout, but that's just a case of, again, a lack of wisdom. A lack of wisdom, where you can't see any hope. It's just too much suffering and there's no hope. And then you identify with cognitive fusion with that suffering. Because things like suffering or even mental afflictions cannot overwhelm you if you don't identify with it. If you identify with it, it can create a lot of suffering. And that's what we do. We identify with that suffering in ourselves and others. We identify with our mental afflictions. Then there's a lot of probability of it completely overwhelming us. So there's two things here. If we avoid cognitive fusion and we develop wisdom, then technically the burnout is impossible. And it's not technically compassion burnout, although it's called compassion burnout. But there I think the word compassion burnout, compassion is used in a sort of a more non-Buddhist sense where compassion is this emotion. No? That can overwhelm us and we can burnt out from that. So just being a little bit, I'm just trying to be very precise, otherwise we get confused about things. Yeah, last question, then we need to finish.
No, you answered it.
So I did?
It's all good.
It's all good? Okay, very good. I'm very happy. Okay. Do you have a quick question?
I thought this, we are driven by afflictions, so this empathy burnout, I think it's also people, they think they can fix others. It's sort of it's a cognitive fusion in a case, but they believe it's a positive attitude that they can try to fix others.
Sure. Again, it's more the cognitive fusion, but it's also, again, lack of wisdom. Yeah, exactly. It's thinking that the source of suffering's out there, so if I fix something there, suffering will go away. It will never. I mean, you can fiddle around with things out there to temporarily alleviate suffering in the very short term, but you cannot fix suffering out there in the long term. And so this leads to burnout because we keep doing things out there and then, of course, still the problems and we think it's hopeless and then we get burnt out.
Yeah, we need wisdom, yeah.
Of course, yeah, and avoid the cognitive fusion. If we do those two things, I think it'll take care of itself. The rest will take care of itself in a good way. Okay, let's finish there. Run over time a bit, so thanks for coming this evening. Hope you got something out of it, and hope to see maybe some of you this weekend, and if not, then I hope to be back next year sometime, so let's see. If Martin invites me. So.
I certainly will.
So thank you.